have a way of snowballing quite quickly. So, for those who are not familiar with what we're going to be discussing this evening, it's how to kosher your kitchen for Pesach. No, just joking. That's not really what we're going to be discussing. We're discussing specifically how to handle, in this time of the coronavirus, how to handle the really, really challenging situation of isolation, and specifically how it relates to the Seder. Ma nishtana ha Pesach hazeh mikol ha Pischos. How is this Pesach different than every other Pesach? I think that list is getting more extensive and more extensive as we go along, and this certainly is something which needs to be addressed and spoken about, and it all has come to a head relatively quickly. So I guess in way of introduction, when the COVID-19 virus first became apparent that it was going to affect the UK in this type of way, I received a WhatsApp message from one of our congregants saying, "Rabbi, I am absolutely sure that this will not even be something that can be considered, but has anyone considered the idea of having a virtual Seder in which we can use technology to interact with one another from different houses, and therefore connect the Seder, even though we won't be in the same room?" So let's be as honest and as open as possible in this conversation. I think all of us will agree that Seder night is a critical functionality, not only of Yiddishkeit for many people, but also central to how people live. The Seder means a lot more to many people than just the Jewish rituals which are attached to it, but also the time of getting together, the time of family. And there is a great sense of loss which is being experienced at this time. I'll speak personally. I wasn't supposed to be here for Pesach. I was supposed to be, and if everyone could just please, who's in Zoom, to stay muted unless they want to be part of the conversation, to make sure that it doesn't affect everyone's hearing. I was supposed to be in Israel with my family, with Jacqueline's family, celebrating our nephew's bar mitzvah. And this was something that myself and Jacqueline, and certainly our children, have been looking forward to for a really long time. Yeah, that's just that in some ways is very, very minor compared to some of the other scenarios that that need to be considered at this time. We have elderly people who would be at their children's Seder, who now are going to be literally on their own. And it's one thing for a family such as myself that will still have, please God, we all are well, a lively Seder. Comparing that to what other people's circumstances are, if we can't be empathetic towards that, then we don't know what Seder is about. We don't know what humanity is about. We don't know what being a caring person is about. So hopefully all of us can already, in the introduction of this headlines conversation, appreciate there is a great dilemma which is at play over here. And yesterday at 4:45 p.m., I had a Zoom meeting with my Rabbi in Israel, with about 80 of us were in attendance, and we discussed what should we do in order to support people in such instances. But to be honest, the one question which we did not ask is suddenly the question which has now become relevant. And that is the question of using technology on Seder night itself in order to link up with people. It just didn't enter our minds. Now, the reason why it didn't enter our minds is because we don't use technology in that fashion on Shabbos or Yom Tov. We just don't. It's not something that we have ever done as a people. Now, I'm speaking here to an open forum, and I am perfectly aware that not everyone follows the same strict guidelines of Shemirat HaMitzvot, of keeping commandments according to the laws that Orthodoxy expects of us. And we certainly, in the Bushy community, appreciate that everyone has their own level of observance, and it's not for us to impose how they should live their life. But if you are a member of the United Synagogue, of an Orthodox community, I would be disingenuous to you if I weren't to tell you what Orthodoxy believes is the halachic way that we should be living our life. If I were to compromise in that way, you would have every right to throw me out as a rabbi. So if the argument about having this type of innovation is built upon the principles of humanity, of concern, of worry about people, we're going to have a very good conversation this evening. If the motivation of the conversation is, well, Rabbi, isn't it time for Orthodoxy to move with the times? Then we might reach an impasse, because one of the reasons why Orthodoxy has developed in the way that it has is because it hasn't been led by the times, but rather has worked within the halachic framework, which tells us how we're supposed to live our life in all times and in all generations and in all circumstances. So, after I got off the phone or the Zoom conversation with my rabbi and 80 of my contemporaries who had all discussed various different ideas and suggestions, I'm sure you'll be very surprised to know that your rabbi was particularly vocal in that conversation amongst the 80 participants. I know, shockingly enough. I got off the phone and I WhatsApp called one of my colleagues here in the UK, Rabbi Johnny Rudin. Some of you know him. He's a good friend of mine. He's now the rabbi of the Finchley Central, one of the Federation shuls. We're very close. We talk about lots of different situations. And we said, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about those people who are really, really isolated? Normally on the Shabbos or Yom Tov, you would be able to knock on the door, be able to go over, even if the person couldn't go to someone's house. But 3 days in a row we're talking about over here. 3 days in which someone can be isolated and who knows what's going on with them. And you can't just walk over to check on them to see how they're doing, because they're supposed to stay socially isolated, and it might not be something which is even possible under the circumstances. And we spoke on the phone for a couple of minutes, and we didn't end off with a good conclusion that we were happy about. And it's just after that conversation that it suddenly appeared on our rabbinic WhatsApp communications a PDF coming from Israel. And for those of you who are on Zoom, I'm going to show you the PDF because I think it's something which warrants being seen. And from there, we'll be able to continue the conversation. Okay, so for those who are not on Zoom, I do want you to be able to see this, so I'll do my best to put onto Facebook afterwards some of these particular relevant pieces of information. The one that which you guys are able to see, those of you who are on the Zoom channel with me, is something from the Igud Chachmei HaMaravi Be'eretz Yisrael. This is an organization of the wise Eastern Israeli rabbinate. For the record, I think it probably is worth, for the record, there is no such organization. But I don't begrudge the fact that they have chosen that title because it does reflect the fact that the rabbis who have signed this particular, what we call a responsa, a she'ela u'teshuvah, a question and an answer format, they signed it and they did so coming together, and they did so all from a particular persuasion of a Moroccan Jewish background, Sephardic background. So this is what they called themselves, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm just going to take a drink of water. So the question which was asked on this particular from this particular responsa has to do with Nish'alnu al Yidei Yehudi Talmid Chacham. We were asked by a wise person, if you're able to use on Seder night some type of mechanism in order that you could connect the old ones with the young ones, the elderly with their families, which they cannot because of the fact that they have these type of they're separated because of the coronavirus, and therefore can we use technology as a way of connecting them? And they further said that the reason why this is particularly relevant is not only because of the older ones, but also because of the younger ones, that they should be able to have a linkage, certainly with their past. A lot of communities, it's the grandparents who keep the traditions going in the family. And as a result of that, it would be particularly relevant as well to be able to do so. So this is the question they were asked. Can you use technology for this purpose in this circumstance, or can you not? And the answer, the response dealt with three different difficult issues, they said, which need to be considered when coming up with whether there could be a solution that technology can be used or technology cannot be used. So the first issue which they represented was the fact that you're using technology, a computer, a smartphone, something along those lines on Yom Tov. Are you allowed to? Is one allowed to use a smartphone or any type of electricity in that type of fashion on Yom Tov? The second one was Ogden Dechol, doing practices which are not typically Shabbat or Yom Tov practices. Is there a separate issue in terms of that as well? And finally, the last one is there concern if one were to engage in this type of practice because of the extenuating circumstances of self-isolation, would this lead in the future to people as well doing the same things in times when there is no such emergency circumstances? So those are the three things which were self-identified by this this group of rabbis that they need to contend with to decide whether this will be permissible or not. Meaning, of course, they recognize that we don't use computers, we don't use communication technology on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Second of all, we try to have Shabbos and Yom Tov activities and not activities which are not in the spirit of the day itself, in order to keep the sanctity of the day. And third, what about what we call the slippery slope? That if these are things which are being done now, perhaps they will be done in other occasions. Now, I have to say, I think I'm going to take a pause here for a moment and just come in with a with an observation. And the observation is as follows. If one were to take a dispassionate view on the incredibly dire circumstances that we are living in, then this would be quite exciting. This would be very exciting from the halachic mind to plumb and to ponder what is the halachic perspective on this type of circumstance. Now, of course, we can't do that because we are mired in tragic circumstances where to say one can take a dispassionate view would mean that one is literally lost their humanity, as discussed before. But there are halachic parameters and long-standing teshuvot and information on the subjects of electricity, on the subjects of such things, and nothing is new under the sun for Yiddishkeit. We're not being given any information here which suddenly makes us say, "Oh, I never thought of that. We never discussed that. That's not something which has ever been encountered before." In many ways, this is well-trodden territory. It's just that we've never had to deal with it, in which the whole world is coming into quarantine or into isolation or into lockdown. So, to the halachic mind, this should not shake us, but rather should be considered an opportunity to look at what do our authorities say on the subject, and how can we apply it to this specific circumstance that we're dealing with in terms of the Seder night. So let's go through some of the aspects which have been discussed in order to understand them better. Electricity, or using electricity on Shabbos or Yom Tov in the first place. Electricity certainly hasn't been around in a functional capacity for forever. Certainly only into the 20th century did it really become something which is relevant whatsoever. And there were different views across the early authorities on how to look at electricity. To accept that all of halachic poskim, all of the decisors would take the same view on any issue would be naive in the extreme. And when electricity first came out, there probably was a lot of lack of understanding of what it actually was. And therefore you had everything from one end of the extreme, where people said that there was a fire which was going through the wire, meaning there was literally an H, a flame, as if you've turned, when you plug something in, you literally are turning on as if you're igniting a lighter, all the way to the other side, in which decisors took the view that nothing was happening whatsoever. So you had one extreme that would say that if one were to use electricity on Shabbat, it would be what we call a Isser D'Oraisa, a biblical infraction, as if you had lit a flame. All the way to the other end, where you had certain authorities who said electricity is completely permissible to be used, because, especially on Yom Tov, because there is nothing which is happening anyway. And therefore, in the early part of the 20th century, there certainly were certain rabbinical authorities, specifically in the Sephardic communities, in the Moroccan communities, and other places, that used electricity on Yom Tov. And we don't have to be afraid to say things like that. However, as information grew and knowledge of what electricity was really about, the completing of a circuit, and what it changes and what it accomplishes, the middle ground became the accepted principle when it came to Jewish practice. And that was that there is a rabbinical transgression for using electricity in cases where there aren't other aspects involved, like cooking or turning on lights, but just the using of electricity in itself is a rabbinical prohibition, which is entirely prohibited on a Shabbat and prohibited on a Yom Tov as well. Now, the authorities over here, which I mentioned in this responsa, are completely au fait with that. They are not arguing to say, yes, electricity is absolutely capable of being used on Yom Tov. They're not saying that is no longer the halachic consensus. It is the halachic consensus. There is no one today in the Orthodox world that says using electricity on Yom Tov is permissible. So none of them are arguing that. But it's important to know the background of where we are when it comes to electricity, where has it come from. So what are they saying? What they've suggested, though, is that rather than it being permissible in general, however, perhaps we're able to say, Baram b'inyanenu, ein tzarich lafas hamachshir, we're not turning on the electricity. The computer is already running. It is already on. The Zoom is already set. And since it's already set, Yumofal b'erev Chag, it's been turned on before Yom Tov. Only issue is what happens if it turns off. You might want to turn it on. There are those who say, because there are lenient opinions that say that you can rely upon it to the minority opinions that would have allowed electricity. So therefore, you can leave it on and not worry, though it might need to be turned off. So these authorities said that electricity, which is turned on beforehand, you're not engaging with it, it's just something which is there in the background, should end up being permissible, even though there's a small chance you might come to turn it on. If it gets turned off, they're not worried about such things. Okay, so now this is probably the most principal part of the argument that they make, that there is, since you're not really doing anything, it's just on in the background, there's no violation which is taking place anyway, which is what led them to allow it to be done. The other example, other issues that they said, because it's for a mitzvah, therefore it's not considered non-Yom Tov-esque, and because it's because of the extenuating circumstance, you won't come to compare it to something else. This is what they have produced and has been issued around and sent around the internet and has all been discussed. So based upon that particular opening lines, we ended up here with a article in the Arut Sheva in the Israel National News, which says Chief Rabbi, head of Tzoma Institute. No, sorry, that's the wrong one. Don't want to give that part away yet. Here we go. With more updates. No, let's see if I can find the right one before we continue. No, I didn't produce the right one. The right one was on several different news agencies in the Jewish world. It basically said rabbis are permitting using Zoom for Seder. That's what it said. And my goodness, did that cause a stir? And in response to that, we have some retractions and comments. We have over here a one website which says the allowance for the Zoom at the Seder is incorrect and should be retracted. This is by someone named Rabbi Yair Hoffman, who states that many of the rabbis who said that they signed the letter had not signed it, or that it was signed only in particular instance and it was grouped together. This is the Jewish way of saying fake news. It didn't really happen the way that said it happened, and they explain there is no question that this ruling is erroneous for a number of reasons, and they address why. Then we have the chief rabbi, head of the Tzoma Institute, attacks rabbi's letter permitting virtual Seder. It's a shame that they misled the public, said chief rabbi Lau in response to the letter permitting use of Zoom to conduct a virtual Seder, and in it he writes that the Tzoma Institute, which is responsible for technological advances to be used on Shabbat, like the Shabbat lift, like the Shabbat scooter, all those types of things. They say the letter stating the ruling is very dangerous, and what people understand from it is even more dangerous, he told. Families rely on this letter to make a Seder with their parents when no rabbi intended to permit such a thing. He added, the letter relies on a specific ruling that using electricity ignites fire, but computers function in a different manner from the types of electrical devices that this ruling was referring to, basically saying that when you're using Zoom or using Facebook Live, you can't say that nothing is actually happening because it's already been lit. The screen's already been lit, and therefore when I'm talking to you, nothing's changing. Like when I light a fire, nothing changes with the fire after the fact. But that's not how electricity, when it comes to computers, work. And there's constantly something happening. I'm not going to tell you what's happening because I don't know anything about computers. But there's something which is changing and happening by the fact that we're having this interaction and what's happening on the screen. These things are being done. So basically, this permissibility has come out has now been challenged by the chief rabbi of Israel, been challenged by the UK Rabbanim and American rabbis, and we end up over here with a situation where clearly there was a very, very well-intended effort. From whom, it's hard to say. All the signers, maybe some of them, not sure. But we're left in a situation now where it doesn't seem that the permissibility which they intended was actually ever the halachic normative practice. Now, does anyone want to comment yet from those who are either watching, partaking with Zoom, or those who are on Facebook Live? If anyone wants to say anything before I continue on with some reflections and some further information to share as well.
Has the chief rabbi said anything yet?
Has the chief rabbi said anything about this specifically? I don't know. The chief rabbi hasn't yet said anything specific on the subject. Of course, when he does, I will bring it to everyone's attention as well. David, do you want to say something? David, are you on mute? You're no longer on mute. I took you off, yeah.
Yeah. Is this seems to be a division between the Ashkenazi world and the Sephardi world?
No, it doesn't seem to be that way. What does seem to be is that there is a specific Moroccan tradition which had a tradition of being more lenient many generations ago when it came to electricity. But no, this is not a Sephardic or Ashkenazic division. We see very clearly that the Sephardic position on electricity is the same today as the Ashkenazic position, and none of them allow the usage of electricity, and certainly the signers of this didn't make up what you would consider to be the main body of Sephardic Jewry and their positions.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Anyone else want to ask anything before we continue on a little bit with what is being discussed? Yeah, so we have some more people raising their hands.
Hello.
So
Can you hear me?
yes, Martin. Yeah, Martin. Yeah.
If you have it on a time switch, I mean, we have our lights on time switches.
Yeah. So thank you, Martin is asking, why is it different than a time switch? After all, with the time switch, we use that all the time, and the difference is that once the time switch is on, but turned on, you don't engage with it, you don't interact with it, nothing happens. Whereas over here, the times with the screen, I'm talking, and things change, and through my talking, whatever it is that changes, I can't tell you. And also, if you're responding back and all those types of stuff, But even me specifically speaking and being on the screen, things are happening. Whereas with a time switch, I could jump up and down in my lounge from today till tomorrow. It's not going to change anything, which is what makes it different. Before we get to the question, another question from Zoom, from David, we also have a question from Yehuda Raven. So for a ruling such as this to be valid for us, who would or could need to have confirmed their opinion for us? Okay, so that's a good question. I think what Jacqueline had brought up was if the chief rabbi were to say that's permissible, then of course that would be very, very good for us. If the chief rabbin of Israel says it's permissible, that would be very good for us. If a recognized central authority were to say that such a thing would be used, and they would have to explain why it would be used and why it would be permissible, that would be something that we could talk about as well. Now, we had another question. Someone else raise their hand, or is that it? From David, are you raising your hand again?
No.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I think we're ready to move on to the next section of this discussion. And what we've been dealing with until now is halachic, from the perspective of what do we do when we have a new circumstance on our hands and we have new technology on our hands. Can it work or can it not work? And the answer seems to be that there is no allowance simply to allow technology to be used because people are in isolation. Now we need to talk about something very different. And what we need to discuss is not simply the fact that people are isolated, but rather the fact that their isolation might put them in a position of harm, or put them in a position where they are vulnerable and are at risk. Now, how do we gauge at risk? There are two levels or two aspects of being at risk, which are both equally important. First, it's physically at risk. If people are isolated and alone and can't use technology, then there is a worry that something might happen to them, and they won't be able to let us know. And the second one is psychologically at risk. The mental health for 3 days of people being in isolation, or being weak and anxious, and not have anyone to support them or to offer them comfort, that could also be equally a great concern. Now, this is a very different question to us having a Seder night, which is different than other Seder nights. Having a circumstance in which things are going to be different this year, in and of itself, is not going to be an allowance to be able to use something like Zoom or other forms of technology in order to override the halachic restrictions. To having a difficult or challenging Seder, first of all, in Bushi at least, and I'm sure in other places as well, we're going to do everything we can to, before Pesach comes in, to create an environment in which we can give experiences, at least virtually, that people will not be able to have on the night itself. For example, Seder in the UK begins with candle lighting at 7:30 p.m. Now, I'm not going to make any assumptions, but it could very well be people who are listening into this headlines discussion this evening would have already planned to have their Seder at 6:30, at a time which would have been more suitable for the elderly or for young families. In which instance, they're going to be able to do something very similar this year, and we could discuss how that should be rolled out. But I would say absolutely to have some type of virtual Seder experience before Yom Tov comes in. Obviously, that won't work for the second night, but it will certainly work before the first night. and that should definitely be encouraged, for the Mana Shtana and the songs to be sung, and for the stories to be told, and for the lessons to be shared, all before Seder comes in. Matova Manayim. Absolutely. To not do that would be criminal under the circumstances. And you might tell me, but Rabbi, going into Pesach is a very busy time. And I would respond to that and to say, is there anything which is worthy of time more than dedicating it towards one's family, especially those who are in need more, and using between now and Seder to encourage members of the family to learn how to use technology properly, so that pre-Seder they can have what they will not be able to have later on in the evening. Go for it. Do it. You have my blessings. But that's very different than being able in and of itself to violate or to waive halachic considerations on Yom Tov. That we wouldn't be able to do simply because it would mean that people wouldn't be able to have the Seder experience which they would want to have on the night. But what about if we're dealing with something else entirely? What about if we're dealing with making sure people who need to be isolated but are very vulnerable and they are at risk, having an open line of communication to make sure that they're okay? What about that? Okay, Francis asked the question, when if we're doing the virtual Seder where you could light together, where you could have the Seder experience, can you actually light candles during that virtual experience? So those are all things that we're going to discuss and to share with the community, how one can conduct a virtual Seder experience. But basically, the person who's lighting candles from that time and on would be bringing in Chag. That doesn't mean that the rest of the family would have to bring in Chag at that time, but the person lighting would already have Yom Tov, which is brought in, and that person would no longer be able to engage in the actual experience. But people watching could watch you light candles. There's nothing wrong with that. It would kind of be like if someone in Israel keeps one day of Yom Tov and here we keep two, that the person in Israel on the second day would be able, if they had a mechanism of doing so, to look into what you guys are doing, because Chag cannot come in. Does that make sense? To make a comparison between them. But specific guidance will be issued a little bit later on as we get closer to Yom Tov. So in order to deal with the actual question of what should one do if there is such vulnerable people at hand, the most important thing is to actually ask the question and to discuss, and so we could discuss together what should be done in order to help out those who are in this type of circumstance. Now, I want to share with you, those who are on Zoom, one further piece of information as well. And this is from Rav Herschel Schachter, who is the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of Rabbeinu Yitzchak Al-Hanan Institute, YU, Yeshiva University. And this piece of information is literally hot off the press. I received it about 20 minutes before this headlines chat was concluded, was ready to begin, and therefore you guys are seeing it here for the first time, or hearing it here for those of you who are on Facebook Live. And I wanted to share what Herschel Schachter has to say about the matter. For those of you who are only hearing about Herschel Schachter for the first time, he is accepted as one of the heads of the OU. So if you're eat and drink OU certified things, he is one of the people certifying it, and generally speaking, he is a very, very prominent halachic authority that is what we consider to be very level-headed and dealing with the times that we're in, as well as keeping with the Jewish traditions as well. So he discusses the psychological considerations of being isolated and what those halachic considerations, what we need to take into account for them. He says as follows: if the government or a physician has decided that an individual must remain in isolation over the course of Yom Tov, and this individual has a psychological condition where physicians who know this patient have determined that there is a possibility that this person being alone over the course of Yom Tov would be in a situation of pikuach nefesh, possible self-harm. If the individual was not able to communicate or speak with family members, then the family members must reach out to this person over Yom Tov to speak on the phone or use the internet by leaving a connection open from before Yom Tov. Says Rav Hershel Schachter, if it is previously determined that someone needs to be in isolation, and that person in isolation is at a genuine risk of their coming to harm to themselves because of that isolation, then there is an obligation to speak to them either through the usage of a phone or the internet by leaving it a live connection in order to do so over Yom Tov. He quotes from Moshe Feinstein, who says that psychological risk is considered just as life-threatening as actual physical harm. So if a person is worried the person might have a breakdown from not being able to communicate with someone else, then that is also considered pikuach nefashos, a risk to the soul, a risk to the health to the life of an individual. And in such an instance, having something like Zoom, which is available in a corner somewhere, that they can have a communication, is a necessity to be done in the circumstances on a Yom Tov. He continues, if a person is physically ill and alone and the physician has determined that there's a possibility the condition is deteriorating further to a point of being life-threatening, what happens if the physician deems that this person could end up becoming physically unwell because of their current circumstance, or psychologically unwell? Then the family must remain in contact using electronic devices with that person over the course of Yom Tov or to check on that person. In other words, so first of all, if a person's already in that circumstance and they have to be alone, then you should be using technology in order to keep contact and communication. If a person might fall into that category going forward, then it's good to check in on them with that open communication still being there. Okay, so we continue on with, he gives further information. Obviously, if there is a carer who's a non-Jew, that non-Jew should be told that they should, if anything changes, should reach out to a family, call them, whatever it might be, to make sure that the person that they're looking after is able to have communication were to be necessary. A person outside of Israel keeping 2 days, the person in Israel is able to communicate with them if the case may be, to check on them as well. So he says, in cases where there's psychological or physical risk, of course you should have communication. Of course you must keep contact to make sure that they are okay. Remember, we're talking about people who are at risk, people that a physician or a doctor says are considered already to be in a state or could enter into a state where there is a concern for their life, a concern for for them keeping being psychologically sound and not having a breakdown. However, if someone is not ill, as described above, however, they must be confined alone because of circumstances related to the coronavirus. What happens if it's simply that someone's in isolation? Then they may not use any electronic devices in order to connect to family members on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Although it is painful and sad to be alone, and people want to be with family and friends, it's not a sakanah nefashos, it's not considered a life-threatening situation, and there's no place at all to allow the violation of Shabbat and Yom Tov in that circumstances. He says something really interesting, that what happens if you're dealing with a case where the people have no ability to run the Seder without the person's input? Then there might be grounds to have some type of not computer, but some type of recorder or something like that on in the background, or that they can hear the Seder experience happening under extreme and pressing circumstances, but certainly not the usage of a video in a way which would make a live experience an interactive one. And then he goes on to just conclude to say that people should remain with their immediate families and not to be visiting each other, and not to break the guidelines of the government and the guidelines of the NHS, and mix or go to one another in order to have a Seder experience, but just to have the way it is under the situation, and that's how we have to live with it. So Rav Hershel Schachter has what we consider to be the normative position, which is, of course, if there's any risk to people's well-being, then obviously communication is necessary. That's called sakanas nefashos, risk to people's lives, or pikuach nefashos, concern for people's well-being, which would override keeping Yom Tov and Shabbat, but not simply in order to have a better Pesach experience. Okay, so that is kind of where I wanted to take this session. Does anyone have any comments or any questions based upon Rav Hershel Schachter's position, or just from getting the holistic view that we're sharing at this time? I seem to have left everyone speechless. Anyone want to share any surprises? Hi, Gary, you want to say something?
With their common sense, obviously,
Gary, I'm not sure if anyone else can hear you well, but for some reason it's not coming that clear. I heard you say that you're very impressed with their common sense, and then everything went a little bit fuzzy from there. I want to try one more time without your microphone.
You sounded like Metal Mickey.
Thanks, Richard. Are there any other questions from the Facebook feed? No. Okay. Yeah, so obviously Rabbi Nick, myself, Jacqueline, and Shira will be looking to see how we can make it the most positive Pesach experience under the circumstance, but all of us are realistic and realize that this is far from ideal. We discussed in the last couple of sessions how to make a good experience and not Passover. But on the other hand, of course, we want to keep the whole sanctity of the experience in any way which is possible under the circumstances. If anyone has any issues about not being able to get their hands on any provisions for the Seder, or alternatively how to deal with Seder if someone's hospitalized, and all of those things which are extremely realistic, of course, we'd be happy to field any of those questions as well. On the one hand, the temptation always is to say, yeah, Mark, do you want to say something?
Sorry, I've got a noise in the background. Something just occurred to me in terms of the mitzvah for Pesach, and someone that is unable to partake because they're unwell or they're alone, and how best to engage those people so they get some form of mitzvah experience, or not mitzvah experience, they're doing a mitzvah and completing the Seder ceremony, if you want to put it in that context, but being prevented to do so because of the halakha aspect of video conferencing in whatever way possible. what should the minimum be, and how can you engage with that?
Okay, well, so Mark, for those of you on Facebook Live and not able to hear, Mark is wondering, how do you deal with the fact that you can't, that someone might be isolated and really lose out on Seder? What can you do? So that's part of the guidelines that we'll be issuing. From what time of the day can we already encourage them via Zoom or via Facebook Live or even on the phone with them, to guide them in how much they should drink, how much they should eat, certainly to be able to listen in to the songs and for them to be able to take part in whichever way will be meaningful for them. For a lot of these people, they might actually be patur from mitzvos, exempt from the obligations because of their circumstance. In other words, if they are genuinely unable to fulfill whatever it might be, that means they're not obligated to do so. If someone's not well enough, if someone is for whatever reason incapable, then that means that the Torah does not expect it of them in the circumstance, and therefore they don't have to feel guilty about it, but nor do we feel like we have to bend things for people who might actually not even have an obligation under the circumstance. In fact, for many of them, it's not about the mitzvah aspect, it's about them being lonely or feeling that they're missing out, which is more of the issue than whether they're actually mitzuveh, whether they're actually obligated in the first place based upon the circumstance that they find themselves in. Okay. So I think we are moving to the end of the headlines for today, unless anyone else has any final comments or questions that they wanted to put forward. I would just say that tonight is Rosh Chodesh. We are beginning the new month in Nisan. Tomorrow morning, 7:45 a.m., we look forward to having a sing-along Hallel Shacharit Live experience, which will be absolutely fabulous. But also it's a time of renewal and beginning, and certainly our tefillah, our prayer, that all those who are unwell, all those who are challenged and suffering in the current crisis with this horrible disease should have a refuah shalema, and that all of us should have a geula, a redemptive experience, and be able to have, please God, not just a Pesach, but the future ahead to be one of blessing for all of us. Chodesh Tov, everyone, and have a very good evening.
Chodesh Tov.
Thank you.